Welcome back, Psychology 2301 students. We have now made it to the next chapter on neuroscience or biology and behavior. So there are going to be a few topics discussed here that I'll review, and as always, contact me if you'd like further discussion or explanation of any of the concepts that show up in this chapter. Now, one of the most significant concepts that is going to be introduced in this chapter is the nature versus nurture debate. If this is the first time you're hearing about the nature versus nurture debate, it essentially questions the impact of biological or genetic influences on various factors, on behavior, on other aspects of development. And that's nature, compared to nurture, which is more about how you were raised, parenting, other environmental influences like the neighborhood where you grew up, the types of school that you went to, how many siblings you had, and other what we would call social forces, right? The nature versus nurture debate is a conflict over essentially whether nature or nurture has a stronger influence on all of these factors that are a part of development. So things like intelligence, psychological disorders, other things that you might inherit, and even various social issues. For many years, there was a question related to sexual orientation and the impact of genetics versus environment on a person's sexual orientation. So as you read through the chapter, you'll find that the nature versus nurture debate, for some, is not really a debate. Most psychological researchers now agree that human behavior is determined by this very complex interplay or interaction of nature and nurture, right? That both of those things are important. So consider this nature versus nurture debate. How would you describe the cause of something like depression or schizophrenia? Are people born with the predisposition for depression or schizophrenia, right? Is there a genetic or biological link? Or are people more so shaped by their overall experiences, parenting style, birth order, even the types of toys that they might have played with in childhood or other experiences that they have had growing up, right? What are your thoughts? Now, typically in this chapter, you will also find some reference to natural selection. And natural selection is described as a fundamental assumption within psychology for the most part. The assumption of natural selection is the foundation of some other ideas that are important to the history of psychology. So the concept of survival of the fittest, for example, states that organisms that will survive in an environment are those that can adapt to the environmental changes and demands of that environment. So, according to this concept, the characteristics that are stronger or better equipped are those that will be passed on to the next generation. Some historical adaptations that are a part of the history of human evolution include bipedalism, encephalization, and language, which are some of the things that you may see come up in the chapter. So bipedalism is movement using two limbs, right? So walking upright. Many historians and researchers focus on bipedalism as a consequence, if you will, of natural selection, as well as those couple of other factors that I just brought up. So back to this nature versus nurture issue. Hold on, gotta move the camera a little bit. So the interaction of biology or genetics and the environmental influences, there are advantages sometimes to one or the other, depending on who you ask. So some people will say the fact that you have both biology and environment is good, right? That's advantageous for humans, because that means that our biology or our genotype is not our destiny, right? That we can be born with a particular DNA, but that we can have an environment that improves our chances of this or that. So theoretically, something like intelligence, right? That we may have this genetic predisposition for a certain level or range when it comes to our intelligence, but that being exposed to the right environment and influences can increase where we fall on that range compared to if we were to grow up in more of a deprived environment. So that there is this possibility for expanding beyond your genes, if you will. Now, genes can shape various aspects of our phenotype, of our behavior, definitely, but that interplay is very important. So think about a trait that you really value. Maybe not intelligence, maybe athleticism, good health even. How much of that trait do you think is determined by your genes or your biology, genetics, DNA, and how much of that trait do you think is determined by your environment? All right, think about that, and feel free to share a discussion board post on the topic if you'd like to explore that a little bit further. Now let's talk a little bit more about the the internal biological side of psychology. A lot of what we know about the human brain behavior comes from a range of psychological, well, we'll call it biological tests that researchers, scientists, doctors are able to perform. And so we've gotten a lot of information from that. It's a benefit for us that we have this information. Rene Descartes in the 17th century argued that humans are animal machines and human action is a mechanical response to the environment. Now, Descartes revolutionized the study of human behavior by suggesting that human physiology, our bodies, could be studied empirically, right? That we have this very structured approach to assessing, studying, looking at cause and effect relationships between events, for example. So empirical observation has been the primary means by which psychologists have studied human behavior in the 20th and moving into the 21st century. So today, neuroscience is actually one of the most rapidly growing areas of research, and it is applied to not just psychology, but other areas of knowledge that we have that have been growing. So we know from this research that the brain is a very complicated organ, and it is an organ in the body. But researchers have developed a variety of techniques that allow them to see, if you will, into the brain and its processes, right? To test, as I said earlier, these cause and effect relationships and situations. So this chapter is going to talk about a few of those techniques that you may have heard of before, some that may be new. Things like EEGs or electroencephalograms or PET scans, positron emission topography, and MRIs, magnetic resonance imaging, all things that allow us to know information about the brain other than actually manipulating it with our hands, for example. So have you ever heard of any of those tests before? Have you ever actually had any of those tests performed on you before? Many of you possibly have, for a variety of reasons, right? After brain trauma, or related to a different illness, possibly, or for job-related screening. You never know. Now, outside of the brain, we talk about some other parts of the central nervous system. The nervous system itself is divided into two parts, right? The general nervous system has the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the central nervous system goes down the center of the body. The brain, spinal cord, pretty simple. That's the central nervous system. The peripheral nervous system, everything else. The peripheral nervous system is also, though, subdivided into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And people often will confuse it and call it automatic, but the name is autonomic nervous system. But you can use that to help you remember, because the autonomic nervous system controls automatic processes, right? So it's further divided into two subdivisions as well. So it just kind of keeps getting divided further and further. The sympathetic nervous system and what's called the parasympathetic nervous system. So we typically will say that the brain is the most important part of the central nervous system. Most people would agree with that, right? Without the brain, then you have nothing to direct the central nervous system or the other areas of the peripheral nervous system. So the brain has three layers, essentially. The brain stem, which is kind of our very sort of automatic part of the brain, if you will, the limbic system, and the cerebrum. So in the chapter, you'll learn more about the various aspects of the brain, the four lobes of the brain, and what those things control to help us with our behaviors, our choices that we may make, interpreting sensations that come into the body, which will connect to another chapter in the future. So you'll find that a lot of the information in this chapter will connect to something that we'll talk about later down the road, right? So the sensation and perception chapter, or the mental health and disorders and diagnoses chapter, even the overall human development chapter, right? All of that will connect to something that you learn here in this chapter. Excuse me. So the nervous system is comprised of something called neurons, of which there are about 200 different types of neurons in the nervous system. Typically, there are three major classes of neurons: sensory neurons, motor neurons, and interneurons. Sensory neurons deliver sensory messages within the nervous system. Motor neurons will impact movement. And then the interneurons typically will connect one neuron to another. These neurons are messengers, really. They send messages throughout the nervous system by firing or sending some sort of electrical impulse that then causes something else to happen, or in some cases not happen. So the action potential, right, that message that being sent, we call it an action potential. It's really an intriguing concept because it occurs in an all or none fashion. Either you have a neuron that fires or it doesn't fire. It's like flipping a switch. You can either turn it on or off, right? It's not like a three-way bulb. It's just an on or off system. So this chapter will talk about action potentials, what those are, how that all or none process really affects our neural messages. Another important piece of the nervous system, though, are neurotransmitters. These are chemical substances that we believe affect the sending and receiving of messages in the brain. So a neurotransmitter can cause a switch to flip or prevent a switch from being flipped. Gotta say that fast more than once. Very difficult. So there are at least 60 substances that are believed to function as neurotransmitters within the brain. And some of those will come up in the chapter. You may have heard of some of them before. Acetylcholine is one. Gamma aminobutyric acid is another. Some that are a little more common are dopamine. You may have heard of that one. Norepinephrine. That one comes up a lot on those emergency room shows. You hear them refer to norepinephrine a lot, and sometimes a few other substances. Serotonin, and even endorphins, right? And so, when we talk about mental disorders, mental health disorders, you'll hear things like dopamine and serotonin come up quite a bit. possibly in the development chapter when we talk more about endorphins. So all of the neurotransmitters are implicated in, again, various actions that we might engage in, and some of them are implicated in various mental states or mental conditions and even mental diagnoses. So for that reason, some of those may be intriguing to some of you. So there's a lot of information in this chapter. It can be an intimidating chapter because it is so biologically focused. So for those of you who are not quite as sciencey, or those of you who may not like things like anatomy and physiology, sometimes it can seem a little bit intimidating. One of the best things to do, in my opinion, is to try to ask yourself, well, why is this information important? How does this connect to what we know about psychology, right? To help you remember some of these new pieces of information, if they are new for you, that may seem kind of overwhelming. And of course, as I said at the beginning of this video, hit me up, send me an email, or post a message to the discussion board if you have specific questions or need additional assistance, and we can schedule some time during office hours to go through the information that's been a little bit more challenging for you, and I can give you some additional explanations and resources. All right, so good luck with this chapter, and I'll see you soon when we get to our next chapter.